The bronze bell of St. Mary's Mission Church had not rung for 17 days, its silence casting an eerie pall over the dusty streets of Cedar Falls, New Mexico territory. High above the town, in the stone tower that pierced the desert sky like an accusing finger, Sister Catherine Morgan pressed her face against the narrow window bars, watching the sun paint the distant mesas in shades of crimson and gold. The heavy iron chain that secured the ancient bell also bound her wrists with a length of blessed rope, a symbol of penance that had become her prison. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1884, and the desert winds carried whispers of change across the territory. Railroad tracks stretched like metal serpents toward the horizon, bringing with them the promise of prosperity and the threat of corruption in this remote outpost where Spanish missions met American expansion, where Catholic tradition clashed with frontier independence. One woman's desperate plea for freedom would soon collide with one man's reluctant journey toward redemption. Far below, a lone rider approached through the shimmering heat waves, his weathered face hidden beneath the brim of a cavalry hat that had seen too many battles. Jake Thompson urged his paint horse forward with the weary resignation of a man who had nowhere left to run, yet couldn't bring himself to stop moving. The church bell tower loomed ahead, its silence as haunting as the screams that still echoed in his dreams from a blood-soaked battlefield in Arizona territory 7 years past. The morning mist clung to Cedar Creek like a shroud as Jake Thompson dismounted near the weathered wooden sign that marked the town limits. His paint horse, a sturdy mare named Dusty, snorted and shook her mane, sensing her rider's unease. The town of Cedar Falls stretched before them like a collection of children's blocks scattered across the high desert floor, its adobe buildings and wooden storefronts baking in the relentless New Mexico sun. Jake had not planned to stop here. For 3 years, he had drifted from town to town across the Southwest, taking odd jobs and avoiding questions about his past. His saddlebags contained everything he owned: a few changes of clothes, his Army-issued Colt revolver, a dented compass that no longer pointed true north, and a collection of letters he could never bring himself to read. The last letter, postmarked from Fort Apache, bore news he was not ready to face. As he led Dusty down Main Street, Jake observed the peculiar quiet that hung over Cedar Falls like morning fog. A few early risers moved about their business with purposeful silence, their conversations conducted in hushed tones. Children played in the dust with unusual restraint, their laughter muted and brief. Even the dogs seemed to bark more softly, as if the entire town existed under some unspoken covenant of discretion. The reason for this unnatural hush became apparent as Jake approached the town center. Rising from the highest hill, St. Mary's Mission Church dominated the landscape with its imposing stone walls and towering bell structure. The bell tower itself was a marvel of frontier architecture, constructed from honey-colored sandstone that glowed like amber in the morning light. But something was wrong with the picture. The bell, visible through the arched openings near the tower's peak, hung motionless and silent, wrapped in heavy chains that glinted like silver bands in the sunrise. Jake paused at the hitching post outside Fletcher's Bakery, drawn by the aroma of fresh bread and the sound of animated conversation drifting through the open doorway. The establishment served as more than a source of sustenance. It functioned as the town's unofficial information exchange, where news traveled faster than telegraph wires, and gossip held more currency than Spanish silver. Inside the bakery, Rose Fletcher presided over her domain with the authority of a frontier matriarch, a woman of generous proportions and even more generous heart. She had arrived in Cedar Falls 15 years earlier as a young widow with nothing but a sourdough starter and an unshakable faith in human nature. Her establishment had become the town's emotional center, a place where secrets were shared over morning coffee and community decisions were debated alongside discussions of the weather. As Jake entered, the conversation briefly stuttered before resuming with forced casualness. 3 men sat around a rough-hewn table near the window, their attention divided between their breakfast and the newcomer, Dr. Samuel Carter, the town's physician, looked up from his newspaper with the mild curiosity of a man accustomed to strangers seeking medical attention. Beside him, Tommy Wilson, a gangling youth of 16 with sun-bleached hair and earnest eyes, studied Jake with the open fascination of someone who had never traveled beyond the county line. Mrs. Fletcher approached with a coffee pot and a welcoming smile that seemed genuine despite the underlying tension in the room. "Morning, stranger. You look like a man who could use some breakfast and maybe some information about our little town." Jake accepted the offered coffee, noting how the ceramic cup warmed his hands despite the desert heat already building outside. "Much obliged, ma'am. Just passing through, but I'm curious about your church bell. Seems to be having some mechanical difficulties." The silence that followed his observation was thick enough to cut with a Bowie knife. Dr. Carter folded his newspaper with deliberate precision. While young Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, Mrs. Fletcher's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed brightness. "Our bell is undergoing a period of blessed silence," she said carefully, refilling his cup though it was still nearly full. "Sometimes the Lord calls us to listen more closely to his whispers rather than proclaiming his word with bronze and iron." The diplomatic non-answer told Jake more than a detailed explanation might have. In his years of drifting, he had developed a keen sense for communities harboring secrets, and Cedar Falls bore all the hallmarks of a town walking on eggshells. The question was whether the secret involved corruption, tragedy, or simple human folly. Dr. Carter cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Are you planning to stay long in Cedar Falls, Mr. Thompson?" "Jake Thompson. And no, I wasn't planning to stay at all. But sometimes plans change based on circumstances." "Young." Tommy's eyes brightened with curiosity that his elders clearly wished he would suppress. "Are you a real cowboy, Mr. Thompson? I mean, do you work cattle ranches and sleep under the stars and fight Indians like in the dime novels?" "Tommy," Mrs. Fletcher warned gently, but Jake held up a hand to indicate he didn't mind the question. "I've worked cattle, son, and I've slept under more stars than I care to count. But fighting Indians isn't something you'd want to read about in any book, real or otherwise. Most folks, regardless of their heritage, just want to live their lives in peace and raise their families without interference." The answer seemed to satisfy Tommy while earning approving nods from the adults. Jake sensed he had passed some sort of test, though he wasn't certain what the passing grade might earn him. As if summoned by their conversation, the bakery door opened to admit a figure that immediately commanded the room's attention. Father Benedict Hayes entered with the quiet dignity befitting his position as parish priest, though Jake noticed the man's shoulders carried a burden that seemed heavier than his clerical robes should allow. The priest was perhaps 55 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and kind eyes that held depths of sorrow behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Good morning, Rose, gentlemen," Father Hayes said, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "I trust everyone is well this beautiful morning that the Lord has provided." Mrs. Fletcher bustled around him with maternal concern. "Father, you look like you haven't slept in days. Are you certain you're taking proper care of yourself?" The priest's smile was wan but genuine. "Sleep comes when the spirit is at peace, dear Rose. Lately, my prayers seem to require extended contemplation." Jake studied the man with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. Father Hayes possessed the bearing of natural authority undermined by current circumstances beyond his control. Whatever was happening with the church bell, the priest was clearly at the center of the storm. "Father," Dr. Carter interjected carefully, Perhaps it's time to consider that some situations require earthly intervention alongside heavenly guidance. The community grows increasingly concerned about the prolonged silence from St. Mary's. Father Hayes's hands tightened around his coffee cup. Dr. Carter, I appreciate your concern, truly I do. But there are matters of spiritual discipline that must be resolved through proper channels. Mother Superior Agnes has assured me that the current situation serves a divine purpose that we may not fully comprehend. The mention of Mother Superior Agnes sent a visible chill through the assembled group. Jake filed away this reaction. Adding another piece to the puzzle he was unconsciously assembling. Religious communities often harbored complex internal politics, but the fear he detected suggested something more troubling than typical ecclesiastical disagreements. Young Tommy, with the fearless honesty of youth, asked the question the adults seemed reluctant to voice. Father, is Sister Catherine going to be all right? She's been up in that tower for more than 2 weeks now, and folks are starting to worry that maybe the penance has gone on long enough. Father Hayes's face went pale, and his cup rattled against its saucer as his hands shook more noticeably. Thomas, such matters are not appropriate for public discussion. Sister Catherine has committed herself to a period of intensive prayer and reflection. We must trust in God's wisdom and timing. But Jake could see the doubt and guilt written across the priest's features as clearly as scripture on parchment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Whatever was happening in that bell tower, Father Hayes was trapped between his pastoral instincts and forces beyond his control. The mention of Mother Superior Agnes suggested that higher ecclesiastical authority was involved, but Jake's military experience had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate command structure and coercion. Mrs. Fletcher attempted to redirect the conversation towards safer topics. Mr. Thompson, if you're planning to stay in Cedar Falls for any length of time, I should mention that we have comfortable accommodations at the Frontier Hotel. Mr. Patterson keeps clean rooms and serves decent meals, though I do say his coffee can't compare to what we serve here. Jake nodded his appreciation for the information while continuing to observe the group dynamics. The locals were clearly protective of their community's reputation while simultaneously desperate for outside assistance with their current crisis. The combination suggested that whatever was wrong with their situation had progressed beyond their ability to resolve internally. I might take you up on that recommendation, Jake said. But first, I'm curious about work opportunities in the area. I'm handy with horses and mechanical repairs, and I notice your church bell seems to need some attention. The reaction to his offer was immediate and telling. Father Hayes went rigid. Dr. Carter leaned back as if physically struck, and even Mrs. Fletcher's perpetual smile disappeared entirely. Only young Tommy seemed pleased by the suggestion. That's a wonderful idea, Mr. Thompson. I bet you could fix whatever's wrong with the bell mechanism and get it ringing again. The whole town misses the sound, especially on Sunday mornings when it called everyone to worship. Tommy, Father Hayes said with unusual sharpness, the bell tower is strictly off-limits to unauthorized personnel. The current situation requires specialized attention from church authorities, not mechanical tinkering by well-meaning strangers. The priest's vehement reaction confirmed Jake's growing suspicion that the bell's silence had nothing to do with mechanical failure and everything to do with human conflict. His years of military service had taught him to recognize when authority figures were following orders they personally disagreed with, and Father Hayes exhibited all the classic signs of a man caught between conscience and coercion. Jake decided to press slightly harder, testing the boundaries of what information the group might reveal. I understand your caution, Father, but I've worked on church bells before, during my time in the cavalry. Sometimes what looks like a complex theological problem turns out to have a simple mechanical solution. Dr. Carter seized upon this revelation with obvious relief. You served in the military, Mr. Thompson? Which unit, if you don't mind my asking? 7th Cavalry, mostly stationed in Arizona Territory. I handled equipment maintenance and repair when I wasn't riding patrol. The mention of his military background seemed to alter the group's perception of him subtly. Where before they had seen a drifting cowboy of uncertain reliability, they now recognized someone with institutional credibility and practical skills. Jake had learned to deploy this information strategically, knowing that frontier communities typically held military veterans in higher regard than civilian wanderers. Father Hayes, however, remained unmoved by the revelation. Mr. Thompson, I'm certain your military experience was valuable in its proper context. But our current situation involves matters of spiritual discipline that transcend mechanical considerations. I must insist that the bell tower remains undisturbed until proper ecclesiastical authorities can address the underlying issues. Jake finished his coffee and placed the cup on the table with deliberate care. Father, I respect your position and wouldn't dream of interfering with church business. But I've been in enough difficult situations to recognize when people are suffering unnecessarily. If there's a way I can help that doesn't conflict with your religious obligations, I'd be honored to offer my services. The offer hung in the air like morning mist, tangible but fragile. Jake could see the internal struggle playing out across Father Hayes's features as pastoral compassion warred with institutional pressure. The priest's hands had stopped trembling, but his eyes held the haunted look of a man forced to compromise his deepest values. Mrs. Fletcher broke the tense silence with characteristic practicality. Well, regardless of bell towers and church business, a man needs proper accommodation and regular meals. Mr. Thompson, let me walk you over to the Frontier Hotel and introduce you to Mr. Patterson. He's always looking for guests who can pay their bills and don't cause trouble. Jake recognized the diplomatic exit strategy and accepted it gracefully. As he rose from the table, he caught young Tommy's eye and saw something unexpected there, hope mixed with desperate determination. The boy was silently pleading for help in a way that reminded Jake painfully of his own youth, when adult authority had failed to protect those who needed protection most. Outside the bakery, Mrs. Fletcher walked beside him with the measured pace of someone choosing her words carefully. The morning sun had burned away the mist, revealing Cedar Falls in sharp detail. The town was larger than Jake had initially realized, with perhaps 40 buildings stretched along Main Street and extending into the surrounding hills. Most structures showed evidence of recent construction or renovation, suggesting a community experiencing growth and prosperity despite its current troubles. Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Fletcher said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, I hope you won't judge our community too harshly based on this morning's conversation. We're good people facing a difficult situation that has no easy answers. Jake studied her profile as they walked, noting the worry lines around her eyes and the way her hands twisted the fabric of her apron. Mrs. Fletcher, I've seen enough of the world to know that good people sometimes find themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. I'm not here to judge anyone. She nodded gratefully but seemed to be wrestling with additional words that remained unspoken. They had reached the front of the Frontier Hotel, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide porch and reasonable accommodations by Frontier standards. Through the windows, Jake could see a lobby furnished with mismatched but comfortable-looking chairs and tables. Rose, came a voice from behind them, and they turned to see Dr. Carter approaching with purposeful strides. The physician had clearly left the bakery immediately after their departure, suggesting he had something to discuss that couldn't wait for a more convenient opportunity. Doctor, Mrs. Fletcher acknowledged with a slight frown. Is everything all right? Dr. Carter glanced around nervously before addressing Jake directly. Mr. Thompson, I wonder if I might speak with you privately for a moment. There are certain medical considerations related to our local situation that might benefit from your military experience. The request was obviously a pretext, but Jake sensed genuine urgency behind the physician's formal politeness. Mrs. Fletcher seemed to understand the subtext as well, because she excused herself with promises to make proper introductions to the hotel proprietor later in the day. Once they were alone, Dr. Carter's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing the strain he had been concealing during the public conversation. "Mr. Thompson, I need to speak plainly with you about a matter that could mean life or death for someone in our community." Jake felt his attention sharpen with the instinctive focus that had kept him alive through countless, dangerous situations. "I'm listening, Doctor." Dr. Carter looked toward the church bell tower, its stone walls glowing like honey in the strengthening sunlight. "That young woman in the tower, Sister Catherine, she's been confined there for 17 days on charges of spiritual disobedience. The conditions are harsh, and I'm genuinely concerned about her physical and mental well-being." "What kind of conditions are we talking about?" "Limited food and water, no proper sanitation facilities, exposure to desert temperature extremes, and complete isolation except for brief visits from Mother Superior Agnes. The tower was never designed for human habitation, Mr. Thompson. It's essentially a stone prison." Jake felt a familiar cold anger building in his chest, the same rage that had once driven him to protect the innocent against institutional cruelty. What was her supposed crime? Dr. Carter hesitated, clearly weighing how much he could reveal without violating confidences. "Sister Catherine has been accused of maintaining inappropriate contact with the outside world and questioning certain policies implemented by Mother Superior Agnes. The specifics are complicated, but I believe she was trying to protect vulnerable members of our community from exploitation." The picture was becoming clearer, and Jake didn't like what he was seeing. Religious communities could become breeding grounds for abuse when authority figures operated without oversight or accountability. His military experience had taught him to recognize the patterns of institutional corruption, and Cedar Falls was displaying all the warning signs. "Doctor, why are you telling me this? You barely know me, and this obviously puts you at considerable risk." Dr. Carter's smile was grim but determined. "Because, Mr. Thompson, you're the first person to arrive in Cedar Falls in months who isn't either part of the problem or too frightened to act. Sometimes desperate situations require taking calculated risks with strangers who might possess the skills and courage necessary to help." Jake looked again toward the bell tower, its imposing height and solid construction making it appear impregnable. But his military engineering experience automatically began cataloging potential approaches and weaknesses. The structure was formidable, but not impossible to breach if the situation became desperate enough to justify extreme measures. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Doctor?" "For now, nothing more than what you've already offered. Stay in town for a few days, observe the situation, and be ready to act if circumstances deteriorate further. I'm hoping that the presence of an experienced outsider might encourage more reasonable behavior from all parties involved." It was a reasonable request that didn't commit Jake to any specific course of action while keeping his options open. He had nowhere else to be and no pressing obligations calling him away from Cedar Falls. More importantly, the situation reminded him uncomfortably of his own past experiences with authority figures who abused their power over vulnerable people. "I'll stay for a while," Jake said finally. "But I want you to understand something, Doctor. If that woman is genuinely in danger, I won't wait for permission or proper channels to act. My military oath included protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and that obligation didn't end when I took off the uniform." Dr. Carter nodded with evident relief. "I wouldn't expect anything less from a soldier. Mr. Thompson, just promise me you'll consult with me before taking any irreversible action. This situation has more complexity than might be immediately apparent, and hasty intervention could make things worse for everyone involved." As they shook hands to seal their understanding, Jake caught a glimpse of movement in the bell tower's highest window. For just a moment, a pale face appeared behind the bars, looking down at the town with an expression of desperate longing. The face disappeared almost instantly, but the image burned itself into Jake's memory with painful clarity. Sister Catherine Morgan was no abstract victim requiring theoretical protection. She was a real woman trapped in an impossible situation, counting on the decency of strangers to prevent her suffering from becoming permanent. The weight of that responsibility settled on Jake's shoulders like a familiar burden, reminding him why he had spent 3 years running from the kind of moral challenges that demanded personal sacrifice. But Cedar Falls had offered him something he hadn't expected to find, a chance to use his hard-won skills for something genuinely worthwhile. The woman in the tower deserved better than the fear and indecision that had paralyzed her community. She deserved someone willing to risk everything to ensure her freedom and safety. Jake Thompson had spent 3 years avoiding such commitments, but his running days were finally over. The Frontier Hotel proved to be exactly as Mrs. Fletcher had described: clean, modest, and managed by a man who valued paying customers over idle curiosity. George Patterson, the proprietor, was a weathered individual in his early 60s, who had clearly seen enough of life's variations to avoid asking unnecessary questions about his guests' backgrounds or intentions. He accepted Jake's payment for a week's lodging with professional courtesy, and provided a second-floor room that offered an unobstructed view of St. Mary's Bell Tower. Jake spent his first afternoon in Cedar Falls conducting what he privately termed reconnaissance, though he was careful to frame his activities as the casual exploration of a potential new resident. He visited the general store, examined the blacksmith's operation, and engaged in seemingly random conversations with various townspeople. Each interaction added another piece to the increasingly troubling picture of a community held hostage by forces beyond their immediate control. The general store was operated by a nervous man named Harold Peabody, whose hands shook noticeably when Jake mentioned his interest in the church's architecture. Peabody's wife, Martha, emerged from the store's back room during their conversation, and quickly steered the discussion towards safer topics like weather patterns and livestock prices. Their fear was palpable, suggesting that whatever consequences had befallen Sister Catherine served as a warning to others who might consider challenging the current authority structure. At the blacksmith shop, Jake found a more receptive audience. In Pete Morrison, a barrel-chested man whose arms bore the permanent burns and scars that marked his profession. Morrison had been shoeing horses in Cedar Falls for 8 years, and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from working with his hands while observing human nature in its various forms. Morrison was willing to discuss the town situation more openly than most residents, though he chose his words carefully and kept his voice low while they talked. According to the blacksmith, Mother Superior Agnes had arrived in Cedar Falls 6 months earlier with credentials from the territorial diocese and immediate authority over all religious matters in the region. Her first actions had involved implementing strict new policies regarding contact between the religious community and the broader population. Sister Catherine had apparently violated these policies by continuing to provide educational services to local children whose families couldn't afford formal schooling. When ordered to cease these activities, she had respectfully requested clarification about how her actions conflicted with the church's mission of service to the community. This request for clarification had been interpreted as defiance, leading to her current imprisonment in the bell tower as both punishment and example. Morrison's account confirmed Dr. Carter's assessment while adding disturbing details about the broader impact of Agnes's policies. Several families had been forced to withdraw their children from the mission school entirely, leaving them without educational opportunities. The church's traditional role as a community gathering place had been severely restricted, with many social and charitable activities suspended indefinitely. Most troubling of all, Morrison revealed that Sister Catherine was not the first religious community member to face punishment under Agnes's authority. 2 other nuns had been transferred to more appropriate assignments in remote locations after questioning various policy changes. Their departures had been so sudden that they hadn't been able to say goodbye to friends and associates in the community. As evening approached, Jake positioned himself at his hotel room window with a cup of coffee and began systematic observation of the bell tower. The structure was approximately 60 feet in height, constructed from local sandstone blocks fitted together with remarkable precision. The tower's design included 4 levels, with the bell chamber occupying the uppermost section beneath a peaked roof of red clay tiles. Sister Catherine was clearly visible through the arched openings of the bell chamber, though the iron bars prevented any possibility of escape through those windows. Jake's military experience allowed him to estimate distances and assess structural vulnerabilities with professional accuracy. The tower's base was solid stone, extending approximately 15 feet above ground level, with no external access points except the single wooden door facing the main church building. The door itself appeared to be secured with both traditional locks and additional iron reinforcements that had obviously been added recently. Jake observed 2 different individuals checking this door during his evening watch. A younger man in clerical robes who matched Tommy Wilson's description of Brother Francis, and an older woman whose black habit and authoritative bearing identified her as Mother Superior Agnes. Both visitors spent considerable time examining the door's security measures before departing, suggesting they were actively concerned about potential rescue attempts. This level of paranoia struck Jake as excessive for maintaining discipline within a religious community, implying that Agnes understood her actions were indefensible and feared outside intervention. Near midnight, Jake witnessed something that transformed his growing concern into active determination to intervene. Sister Catherine appeared at the tower's eastern window, pressing her face against the bars while extending her arms as far as the confining space would allow. Her posture conveyed desperate longing for the freedom that lay tantalizingly beyond her reach, and even from his distant vantage point, Jake could see the physical toll that 17 days of imprisonment had exacted. The woman's movements were slower than they should have been for someone her apparent age, suggesting malnutrition or illness brought on by inadequate care. Her clothing appeared rumpled and stained, indicating that basic hygiene requirements were being neglected. Most alarming of all, she remained at the window for nearly an hour, staring at the night sky with the fixed intensity of someone whose mental state was beginning to deteriorate under the stress of prolonged isolation. Jake had seen similar symptoms in prisoners of war during his military service, and he recognized the warning signs of psychological breakdown that preceded complete mental collapse. Sister Catherine was approaching a critical threshold beyond which permanent damage became increasingly likely. Whatever theological justifications Mother Superior Agnes might offer for her actions, she was torturing another human being with methods that violated both civil law and basic moral standards. The following morning brought unexpected developments that accelerated Jake's timeline for potential intervention. Dr. Carter appeared at the hotel before dawn, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. The physician had attempted to gain access to the bell tower the previous evening, citing medical necessity, but had been firmly refused by Brother Francis, who claimed to be acting under direct orders from Mother Superior Agnes. According to Dr. Carter, Brother Francis had stated that Sister Catherine's physical and spiritual welfare were being adequately monitored by appropriate religious authorities, and that secular medical intervention would interfere with the divine purposes being served by her current tribulation. When Dr. Carter had pressed for specific information about her condition, Brother Francis had threatened to report his interference to territorial church officials who possessed authority to revoke his medical license. The threat carried real weight because territorial medical licenses were issued through a bureaucratic process that included moral character evaluations by religious leaders. Dr. Carter's ability to practice medicine in Cedar Falls depended partly on maintaining acceptable relationships with local church authorities, giving Mother Superior Agnes significant leverage over his professional activities. Jake absorbed this information while formulating plans that took into account the complex web of institutional relationships constraining the community's response options. Direct confrontation with religious authorities would likely result in his ejection from Cedar Falls before he could accomplish anything meaningful. More subtle approaches would be required to gather additional intelligence and position himself for effective action when the opportunity arose. His planning was interrupted by young Tommy Wilson, who appeared at the hotel's back entrance with the furtive manner of someone engaged in clandestine activities. The boy had obviously been waiting for Dr. Carter's departure before approaching, suggesting he possessed information that couldn't be shared in the physician's presence. Tommy's news was both encouraging and alarming. Sister Catherine had managed to communicate with him through a series of hand signals, visible from certain angles near the church grounds. She had indicated that her physical condition was deteriorating rapidly, but more importantly, she had conveyed information about Mother Superior Agnes's plans that suggested the current situation was merely preparation for something far worse. According to Tommy's interpretation of Sister Catherine's signals, Agnes was expecting the arrival of additional church officials within the next few days. These officials possessed authority to transfer Sister Catherine to a remote convent location, where her fate would be entirely beyond the reach of local intervention. Once this transfer occurred, the community would lose any opportunity to help her, and she would disappear into the institutional maze of territorial religious bureaucracy. Tommy's account was confirmed by information he had overheard during conversations between Agnes and Brother Francis. The boy had developed remarkable skills in covert observation, partly from natural curiosity and partly from a growing sense that adult authority figures couldn't be trusted to protect the innocent. His intelligence gathering had revealed that Agnes's harsh policies were part of a broader campaign to establish absolute control over religious activities throughout the region. Sister Catherine's resistance had made her a symbol of opposition that Agnes needed to eliminate before other community members found the courage to challenge her authority. The public nature of her punishment served multiple purposes: breaking her individual will, intimidating potential supporters, and demonstrating the consequences of defiance to anyone considering similar resistance. Jake recognized the tactical sophistication behind Agnes's approach while noting several vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with appropriate skills and determination. The Mother Superior's plan depended on maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious discipline while preventing outside scrutiny of her methods. Any development that exposed her actions to broader territorial oversight would undermine her position significantly. More immediately, the impending arrival of transfer officials created a deadline that eliminated the luxury of extended planning and preparation. If Sister Catherine was going to be rescued, the attempt would need to occur within the next 48 hours, before additional security measures could be implemented and before she could be moved beyond reach. Tommy's eagerness to participate in any rescue effort was both touching and problematic. The boy possessed valuable local knowledge and had already demonstrated remarkable courage in gathering intelligence, but involving him in direct action would expose him to retaliation that could ruin his future prospects in Cedar Falls. Jake needed to balance Tommy's desire to help against the moral responsibility of protecting him from consequences he wasn't old enough to fully understand. After careful consideration, Jake developed a role for Tommy that would utilize his skills while minimizing his exposure to immediate danger. The boy would continue his intelligence-gathering activities, focusing specifically on the arrival times and security arrangements for the expected transfer officials. This information would be crucial for timing any rescue attempt to avoid unnecessary confrontations with additional personnel. Meanwhile, Jake would conduct his own reconnaissance of the bell tower's structural vulnerabilities and develop specific plans for gaining access to Sister Catherine's prison. His military engineering background included training in breaching, fortified positions, and the tower's medieval construction presented challenges similar to those he had encountered during various frontier conflicts. The stone walls were formidable but not impregnable. Jake's examination of the tower's base revealed several potential weaknesses where centuries of weather exposure had created small gaps in the mortar joints. More promising still, the tower's construction included iron brackets and handholds that had been installed to facilitate maintenance of the bell mechanism. These features could potentially provide a climbing route to the upper levels, though such an ascent would require considerable skill and carry significant risks. Jake's assessment was complicated by the need to plan for Sister Catherine's condition and capabilities. After 17 days of imprisonment with inadequate food and water, she might lack the physical strength necessary to participate actively in her own rescue. Any plan would need to account for the possibility that she would require assistance during the escape process, potentially including being carried or supported during the descent from the tower. The logistics of such an operation were daunting, but not impossible for someone with Jake's background and experience. His years of military service had included training in combat rescue operations, and he had successfully extracted wounded personnel from hostile territory under similarly challenging circumstances. The main difference was that his current mission lacked the institutional support and backup resources that had been available during wartime operations. As Jake refined his preliminary plans, he became increasingly aware that success would depend partly on factors beyond his direct control. Weather conditions, the timing of guard rotations, and Sister Catherine's physical and mental state would all influence the feasibility of various rescue scenarios. More fundamentally, the success of any rescue attempt would depend on having somewhere safe to take Sister Catherine once she was freed from the tower. This consideration led Jake to seek additional allies within the Cedar Falls community, individuals who possessed both the courage to oppose Anna's authority and the resources necessary to support a fugitive nun until alternative arrangements could be made. His military experience had taught him that successful operations required secure bases of operation and reliable supply lines, principles that applied equally to rescuing imprisoned civilians. Mrs. Fletcher emerged as a promising candidate for COFO. This role, though Jake approached her recruitment with considerable caution. The bakery owner clearly disapproved of Anna's methods and had demonstrated genuine concern for Sister Catherine's welfare, but her business interests and community standing could be jeopardized by direct involvement in rescue activities. Jake needed to determine whether her opposition to Agnes was strong enough to justify accepting such significant personal risks. His opportunity came when Mrs. Fletcher invited him to share dinner at her private residence behind the bakery. The meal was simple but delicious, featuring fresh bread, roasted chicken, and vegetables from her kitchen garden. More importantly, the setting provided privacy for the kind of sensitive conversation that couldn't be conducted in public spaces, where they might be overheard by Anna's supporters. Mrs. Fletcher's home reflected her personality perfectly, comfortable without being ostentatious, welcoming without being presumptuous, and organized with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex responsibilities. The walls were decorated with family photographs and religious imagery that suggested deep faith combined with practical wisdom about human nature and institutional limitations. During dinner, Jake gradually steered their conversation toward more serious topics, testing Mrs. Fletcher's willingness to discuss the community's current crisis in specific terms. Her responses revealed both sophisticated understanding of the situation's complexity and genuine anguish about her inability to help Sister Catherine through conventional means. Mrs. Fletcher had known Sister Catherine for 3 years, since the young woman's arrival in Cedar Falls as part of the mission's educational outreach program. During that time, Sister Catherine had become beloved by local families for her dedication to teaching children and her willingness to provide assistance with various community needs that extended far beyond formal religious duties. The nun's background included training as a teacher in Chicago before she had answered what she described as a calling to religious service on the frontier. Her educational skills had made her invaluable to families who lacked access to formal schooling for their children, and her gentle manner had made her an effective counselor for women facing various personal and family difficulties. Mother Superior Agnes's policies had abruptly terminated these activities, creating significant hardship for families who had depended on Sister Catherine's services. Several children had been forced to abandon their education entirely, while women who had relied on her counseling found themselves without support during times of crisis. The broader community impact of Agnes's actions had been far more severe than the punishment of a single individual. Mrs. Fletcher's account confirmed Jake's assessment that Agnes's real objective was establishing absolute control over religious activities rather than addressing any legitimate disciplinary issues. Sister Catherine's imprisonment served as a highly visible demonstration of what would happen to anyone who challenged the new authority structure, regardless of their motives or the community benefit of their actions. As the evening progressed, Jake began carefully introducing the possibility that conventional approaches to resolving the crisis might prove inadequate. He emphasized his respect for proper legal and religious channels while noting that such processes often move too slowly to prevent irreversible harm to vulnerable individuals. Mrs. Fletcher's responses suggested she was beginning to reach similar conclusions, though she remained reluctant to acknowledge them explicitly. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Fletcher revealed that she had received a visit from Mother Superior Agnes earlier that day. Agnes had made it clear that anyone providing assistance or comfort to Sister Catherine's supporters would be considered complicit in her defiance and subject to similar consequences. The threat had been delivered with the kind of calm certainty that suggested Agnes possessed both the authority and the inclination to carry it out. This revelation transformed Mrs. Fletcher's theoretical concern into personal fear, and Jake could see her wrestling with the implications for her business and community standing. At the same time, the direct threat seemed to strengthen her resolve rather than intimidating her into submission. She had spent too many years building relationships and providing service to the Cedar Falls community to allow an outsider to destroy everything through intimidation and abuse of authority. By the end of the evening, Jake had gained a valuable ally who possessed both moral courage and practical resources necessary to support rescue operations. Mrs. Fletcher agreed to provide safe haven for Sister Catherine if Jake could successfully extract her from the bell tower, and she committed to using her community connections to gather additional support for their cause. More importantly, Mrs. Fletcher revealed that she wasn't the only community member who had received threatening visits from Agnes. The Mother Superior was systematically intimidating anyone who had expressed sympathy for Sister Catherine, creating a climate of fear designed to prevent organized resistance to her authority. This campaign of intimidation provided additional evidence that Agnes understood her actions were indefensible and feared community opposition. As Jake walked back to the hotel under a canopy of desert stars, he reflected on how much the situation had changed since his arrival in Cedar Falls just 48 hours earlier. What had begun as a casual stop in an unremarkable frontier town had evolved into a complex rescue operation that would test all of his military skills and moral courage. The stakes were clear. Sister Catherine's physical and mental survival depended on immediate intervention, while the broader community's freedom from religious tyranny required someone willing to challenge Agnes's authority directly. Jake possessed the skills necessary to attempt such a rescue, but success would require perfect timing, considerable luck, and the kind of personal commitment he had spent 3 years trying to avoid. Standing outside the Frontier Hotel, Jake looked up at the bell tower silhouetted against the night sky. Somewhere in that stone prison, a woman who had dedicated her life to serving others was counting the hours until her transfer to even worse conditions. She deserved better than the fear and inaction that had paralyzed her community, and Jake was the only person positioned to provide it. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable rather than difficult. Jake Thompson had spent 3 years running from the kind of moral challenges that demanded personal sacrifice, but his running days were finally over. Tomorrow night, he would either free Sister Catherine from her stone prison or die in the mine. Attempt. There were worse ways for a man to find his purpose. Dawn brought unwelcome news that shattered Jake's carefully laid plans before he could implement them. Tommy Wilson appeared at his hotel window before sunrise, his face pale with urgency and fear. The boy had spent the night monitoring activity around the church grounds and had witnessed the arrival of a black carriage bearing territorial religious officials nearly 12 hours ahead of schedule. 3 men in formal clerical attire had emerged from the carriage under cover of darkness, accompanied by 2 armed guards who possessed the bearing of professional enforcers rather than ceremonial escorts. The group had proceeded directly to Coup, a private meeting with Mother Superior Agnes that continued well past midnight, suggesting they were coordinating plans that required considerable discussion and preparation. More ominously, Tommy had observed the installation of additional security measures around the bell tower during the early morning hours. Brother Francis had supervised the placement of iron bars across the tower's ground-level door, transforming what had been a simple wooden barrier into something resembling a prison cell entrance. The modifications appeared designed to prevent any possibility of unauthorized access while the transfer preparations were completed. Jake absorbed this intelligence while rapidly revising his operational timeline and tactical approach. The early arrival of church officials had eliminated his margin for extended preparation and reconnaissance, forcing him to choose between immediate action with inadequate planning or accepting that Sister Catherine would be lost to the territorial religious bureaucracy forever. The choice, when viewed in those terms, was no choice at all. Jake had seen too many situations where good people suffered because others failed to act when action was still possible. His military experience had taught him that imperfect plans, executed with determination, often succeeded where perfect plans delayed too long inevitably failed. Tommy's intelligence gathering had revealed additional details about the transfer, arrangements that would influence Jake's tactical decisions. The officials planned to remove Sister Catherine from Cedar Falls that very evening, using darkness to minimize community observation and potential protest. The transfer would occur under guard escort, with Sister Catherine transported in chains, to prevent any possibility of escape during the journey. The destination was a remote convent facility in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, nearly 200 miles northeast of Cedar Falls. Once Sister Catherine reached that location, she would be completely beyond the reach of local intervention, isolated in an institutional setting where her treatment would be subject to no external oversight or accountability. Jake recognized the sophistication of Anna's strategy while noting several vulnerabilities that could still be exploited by someone willing to accept considerable personal risk. The Mother Superior's plan depended on maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious authority while preventing close examination of her methods. Any development that forced her to explain her actions publicly would undermine her position significantly. More immediately, the compressed timeline meant that any rescue attempt would need to occur during broad daylight, eliminating the cover of darkness that Jake had planned to utilize. Daytime operations carried significantly higher risks of detection and community exposure, but they also offered certain tactical advantages that an experienced operator could exploit effectively. The most promising opportunity lay in the fact that Agnes's security measures were designed primarily to prevent escape rather than to repel external assault. The additional iron bars and guards focused on the tower's interior access points, while the exterior walls remained relatively undefended. Jake's military engineering background suggested several approaches that could bypass these defensive preparations entirely. The key was recognizing that medieval tower construction included design features intended to facilitate maintenance and repair of the bell mechanism. These features typically included external anchor points, drainage systems, and structural elements that could serve as climbing aids for someone with appropriate skills and equipment. Jake spent the morning conducting a careful survey of the tower's exterior walls, disguising his reconnaissance as casual interest in the church's architectural features. His examination revealed several promising climbing routes that would allow access to the upper levels without requiring passage through the heavily secured ground floor entrance. The most viable approach involved utilizing a series of iron brackets and stone projections on the tower's north face, which offered handholds and footing all the way to the bell chamber level. The route would be technically challenging and extremely dangerous, particularly given the need to complete the ascent while carrying equipment necessary for Sister Catherine's descent, but it was feasible for someone with Jake's mountain climbing experience. The descent presented even greater challenges, since Sister Catherine's weakened condition would likely prevent her from participating actively in the climbing process. Jake would need to devise a method for lowering her safely to ground level, probably using rope systems that he would have to improvise from available materials. His planning was complicated by the need to coordinate the rescue attempt with community support activities that would provide distraction and cover for the actual operation. Mrs. Fletcher had agreed to organize what appeared to be a normal church social gathering that would draw Agnes and her supporters away from the immediate vicinity of the bell tower during the crucial phases of the rescue. The social gathering would serve multiple purposes beyond simple distraction. It would provide a legitimate reason for community members to be present near the church grounds, creating witnesses who could testify to any excessive force used by Agnes's supporters. More importantly, it would establish a crowd situation that would make it difficult for the church officials to pursue aggressive retaliation without risking public confrontation. Dr. Carter had agreed to position himself near the church during the rescue attempt, ostensibly as a participant in the social gathering, but actually prepared to provide immediate medical attention if Sister Catherine required emergency care. His presence would also add professional credibility to any subsequent testimony about her condition and treatment while imprisoned in the tower. Tommy Wilson's role involved creating a diversion at the opposite end of the church complex that would draw Brother Francis and any other guards away from the bell tower area. The boy had discovered that the church's main altar contained valuable silver items that had been donated by prominent territorial families, and he planned to trigger the theft alarm system that would demand immediate investigation by all available security personnel. The coordination of these various elements required precise timing that left little margin for error or unexpected complications. Jake's military experience had taught him to expect Murphy's Law to operate with particular vigor during complex operations, and he had developed contingency plans for several likely failure scenarios. If the climbing route proved impassable, Jake had identified alternative approaches that involved greater risk but remained technically feasible. If Sister Catherine was too weak to participate in her own rescue, he had prepared equipment for carrying her during the descent. If community support failed to materialize or proved inadequate, he was prepared to proceed with the operation as a solo mission. The one scenario for which no contingency planning was possible involved the arrival of additional security forces that would overwhelm any individual rescue attempt. Jake's assessment suggested that Agnes's current resources were adequate to maintain control over the immediate situation, but insufficient to repel a determined assault by someone with military training and appropriate equipment. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across Cedar Falls, Jake made his final preparations with the methodical attention to detail that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. His equipment included climbing rope purchased from the general store under the pretext of repairing his horse's tack, iron spikes and a small hammer ostensibly needed for horseshoe repairs, and a collection of tools that could serve multiple purposes during the rescue operation. More importantly, Jake had prepared mentally for the probability that the rescue attempt would mark the end of his anonymous drifting lifestyle, regardless of its outcome. Success would make him a hero to some and a dangerous criminal to others, while failure would likely result in his imprisonment or death. Either way, the quiet anonymity that had protected him for 3 years would be permanently shattered. The realization brought unexpected relief rather than anxiety. Jake had spent too long running from the kind of moral challenges that gave meaning to a man's existence. Sister Catherine's predicament offered him an opportunity to use his hard-won skills for something genuinely worthwhile, and he found himself eager to accept the responsibility regardless of personal consequences. His meditation on duty and sacrifice was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Fletcher, who brought news that would fundamentally alter the nature of the evening's activities. The bakery owner had received an unexpected visit from Father Hayes, who had finally found the courage to challenge Mother Superior Annes's authority directly. According to Mrs. Fletcher's account, Father Hayes had confronted Agnes with evidence that her treatment of Sister Catherine violated both church canon law and territorial civil statutes regarding prisoner welfare. The priest had demanded immediate access to Sister Catherine for medical evaluation and had threatened to report the situation to higher church authorities if his requests were denied. Agnes's response had been swift and decisive. She had declared Father Hayes spiritually unfit for pastoral duties and had confined him to his quarters, pending investigation by the visiting church officials. Brother Francis had been assigned to guard the priest and ensure that he had no contact with community members who might support his position. This development meant that the only legitimate church authorities sympathetic to Sister Catherine had been neutralized, leaving the community without any official recourse for challenging Agnes's actions. At the same time, Father Hayes's courageous stand had provided moral validation for more drastic intervention methods that might otherwise have seemed inappropriate. Mrs. Fletcher's news also revealed that Agnes's position was less secure than she had attempted to project. The Mother Superior's need to silence Father Hayes suggested that she feared official scrutiny of her methods, and her increasingly authoritarian responses indicated desperation rather than confidence in her authority. Jake recognized these signs from his military experience with commanders who had exceeded their legitimate authority and feared accountability for their actions. Such individuals often became more dangerous as their positions deteriorated, but they also became more vulnerable to well-planned challenges that exposed their weaknesses publicly. The changing circumstances required modifications to Jake's operational plans, but they also created new opportunities that could be exploited by someone with appropriate tactical flexibility. Father Hayes's confinement meant that the church rectory would be under guard surveillance, potentially drawing security personnel away from the bell tower area during critical phases of the rescue operation. More significantly, the priest's moral stand had begun to inspire other community members to question Agnes's authority more openly. Mrs. Fletcher reported that several prominent families were privately discussing the possibility of lodging formal complaints with territorial authorities, though none had yet found the courage to act on these discussions. Jake realized that the success of his rescue operation could provide the catalyst necessary to transform private doubts into public resistance. If Sister Catherine could be freed and provided with an opportunity to testify about her treatment, the resulting community outrage might be sufficient to force Agnes's removal and prevent similar abuses in the future. This broader perspective added strategic importance to what had initially been conceived as a straightforward rescue mission. Jake was no longer simply saving one woman from unjust imprisonment. He was potentially liberating an entire community from religious tyranny that had paralyzed their ability to protect vulnerable members. As evening approached, Jake positioned himself in his hotel room to monitor the final preparations for both the rescue operation and the transfer arrangements that would eliminate any future opportunities for intervention. Through his window, he could observe increased activity around the church complex as Agnes's supporters prepared for Sister Catherine's removal under cover of darkness. The black carriage that would transport Sister Catherine had been positioned near the church's main entrance, with the armed guards maintaining watch over both the vehicle and the surrounding area. Brother Francis moved between the rectory and the bell tower with obvious nervous energy, checking security arrangements repeatedly while attempting to project an authority he clearly didn't feel. Most telling of all, Mother Superior Agnes herself appeared at the bell tower door twice during Jake's observation period, each time examining the newly installed iron bars and locks with the attention of someone who understood that her entire future depended on preventing Sister Catherine's escape or rescue. Jake's military experience allowed him to read the tactical situation with professional accuracy. Agnes's forces were adequate for maintaining control over the immediate situation, but were stretched thin across multiple security requirements. The guards were professionals, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory without extensive local intelligence or community support. More importantly, Agnes's defensive preparations focused primarily on preventing conventional rescue attempts. That would involve direct assault on the tower's secured entrances. The possibility of external climbing access appeared not to have occurred to someone whose experience lay in institutional politics rather than military operations. As twilight descended over Cedar Falls, Jake began his final equipment check and mental preparation for an operation that would determine not only Sister Catherine's fate, but also his own future direction. The rescue attempt would be technically challenging and extremely dangerous, but it represented something he had been searching for throughout 3 years of aimless drifting. A chance to use his skills and training for a cause that transcended personal survival. The woman imprisoned in the stone tower above deserved better than the fear and indecision that had paralyzed her community. She deserved someone willing to risk everything to ensure her freedom and safety, and Jake Thompson was finally ready to be that person. Outside his window, the first stars appeared in the desert sky, their distant light reminding him of nights spent on military campaign when success and failure were measured by the lives saved or lost through individual courage and competence. Tonight would test everything he had learned during those years of service, and Sister Catherine's survival would depend on his ability to apply hard-won lessons under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Jake Thompson had spent 3 years avoiding such tests, but his time of running was finally over. Within the next few hours, he would either prove worthy of the trust placed in him or die attempting to honor the obligations that defined a man's true character. The stakes could not have been higher, and Jake found himself grateful for the clarity that came with accepting absolute responsibility for another person's welfare. Whatever happened during the night ahead, he would meet it with the courage and competence that his military training had instilled, and that Sister Catherine's desperate situation demanded. The rescue of Sister Catherine Morgan was about to begin. The clock in the hotel lobby chimed 8 times as Jake slipped through the back exit into the alley behind Main Street. Cedar Falls had settled into its evening routine, with most residents gathered around dinner tables or relaxing on front porches to escape the lingering heat of the desert day. The normalcy of these domestic scenes contrasted sharply with the life or death drama about to unfold at the church complex on the hill above town. Jake moved through the shadows with the practiced stealth of a cavalry scout, utilizing drainage ditches and building corners to avoid the pools of lamplight that marked the most traveled paths through Cedar Falls. His equipment was distributed across his body in a configuration that balanced accessibility with concealment. Rope coiled beneath his jacket, climbing spikes secured in specially modified boot sheaths, and a collection of tools arranged to minimize noise during movement. The church grounds appeared deceptively peaceful as Jake approached from the north side, where a grove of cottonwood trees provided natural concealment within 50 yards of the bell tower's base. The social gathering, organized by Mrs. Fletcher, was proceeding according to plan on the church's south lawn, with nearly 30 community members participating in what appeared to be an impromptu prayer service and fellowship meal. From his concealed position, Jake could observe the tactical situation with professional clarity. Brother Francis patrolled the perimeter of the bell tower with mechanical regularity, completing a circuit every 12 minutes that brought him past each face of the structure. The armed guards remained near the black carriage, their attention focused primarily on the road approaches that would carry Sister Catherine away from Cedar Falls forever. Mother Superior Agnes moved between the social gathering and the bell tower with obvious anxiety, her austere features revealing the strain of maintaining authoritative composure while managing a situation that was rapidly moving beyond her control. Each time she approached the tower, she examined the newly installed security measures with the obsessive attention of someone whose entire future depended on preventing Sister Catherine's escape. Jake's military experience allowed him to identify the critical timing window that would provide maximum opportunity for successful infiltration. Brother Francis's patrol pattern included a 4-minute gap when the tower's north face remained unobserved, while the guards' attention was consistently drawn toward the social gathering during periods of increased activity and noise. The climbing route Jake had selected began at a point where centuries of weather erosion had created handholds in the tower's stone foundation. From there, a series of iron brackets installed during the original construction provided access to the tower's second level, where decorative stonework offered additional climbing opportunities all the way to the bell chamber. As Jake prepared to begin his ascent, Tommy Wilson's diversion activated with perfect timing. The church's theft alarm system erupted in a cacophony of bells and shouting that immediately drew Brother Francis toward the main sanctuary. Within moments, both armed guards had abandoned their positions near the carriage to investigate what appeared to be a serious security breach involving the church's valuable silver altarpieces. Jake emerged from concealment and sprinted across the open ground to the base of the bell tower, reaching the starting point of his climbing route while the diversion continued to occupy all available security personnel. The initial handholds were exactly as he had anticipated, rough but adequate for someone with his experience and upper body strength. The first 20 feet of ascent proceeded smoothly, with Jake making steady progress up the tower's north face while remaining invisible to anyone positioned on the church grounds below. The iron brackets were solidly anchored and properly spaced, allowing him to maintain a rhythm that balanced speed with safety considerations. At the 30-foot level, Jake encountered his first serious obstacle. One of the iron brackets had loosened over the decades, pulling partially free from the stone wall when he applied his full weight to it. The sudden shift in his support system nearly caused a catastrophic fall that would have ended both the rescue attempt and quite possibly his life. Jake's military training kicked in automatically, his body responding to the emergency with the kind of disciplined reaction that separated professional soldiers from amateur adventurers. He redistributed his weight across multiple contact points while securing a more stable handhold, then continued his ascent using a modified technique that avoided placing excessive stress on any single anchor point. The delay caused by this complication meant that Jake was still exposed on the tower's exterior wall when Brother Francis completed his investigation of Tommy's diversion and returned to his patrol duties. The monk's reappearance created a critical moment where discovery seemed inevitable, forcing Jake to press himself against the stone wall and remain absolutely motionless while Brother Francis passed directly beneath his position. The near detection experience reminded Jake that his margin for error was essentially non-existent. Any significant delay or complication during the climbing phase would expose him to discovery by guards, who possessed both the authority and the inclination to use lethal force against intruders. Sister Catherine's rescue depended on his ability to reach the bell chamber, free her from her chains, and begin the descent before Inez's supporters realized what was happening. Jake resumed his ascent with renewed urgency, pushing his climbing pace to the maximum sustainable rate while maintaining the silence necessary to avoid acoustic detection. The tower's upper sections proved more challenging than the lower levels, with fewer handholds and greater exposure to the desert winds that threatened to upset his balance during critical movements. At the 50-foot level, Jake reached the decorative stonework that surrounded the bell chamber itself. The carved stone figures and architectural details provided excellent handholds, but they also required careful navigation to avoid damaging elements that might be historically or religiously significant. Jake's respect for the craftsmanship involved in the tower's construction influenced his climbing technique, even under the extreme time pressure of the rescue operation. The final approach to the bell chamber required Jake to traverse horizontally across the tower's east face, exposing him to potential observation from the social gathering below. Mrs. Fletcher had positioned the community members to provide maximum distraction for Agnes and her supporters, but Jake remained visible to anyone who happened to look up at precisely the wrong moment. Fortunately, the social gathering had evolved into what appeared to be an impromptu prayer service, with participants focused downward in meditation rather than scanning the surrounding area for unexpected activity. Jake completed his horizontal traverse and reached the bell chamber's exterior wall without triggering any alarm or detection by the guards below. The bell chamber itself was accessible through arched openings that had been designed to allow the sound of the bell to carry across the surrounding countryside. Iron bars had been installed across these openings to prevent escape, but Jake's examination revealed that the bars were secured with relatively simple lock mechanisms that could be defeated by someone with appropriate tools and knowledge. Jake's military experience included training in lockpicking and security defeat techniques that proved invaluable in this situation. Using specialized tools improvised from his climbing equipment, he was able to manipulate the lock mechanism and remove one of the iron bars without creating noise that would alert the guards below. The moment Jake slipped through the opening into the bell chamber itself marked a fundamental transition from technical climbing challenge to human rescue operation. Sister Catherine was immediately visible in the dim light filtering through the tower's windows, and her condition was far worse than Jake had anticipated based on external observations. The woman who had once served as Cedar Falls' beloved teacher and counselor was barely recognizable after 18 days of imprisonment in the stone tower. Sister Catherine appeared to have lost significant weight, her religious habit hanging loosely on a frame that showed clear evidence of malnutrition and dehydration. Her hair, which should have been hidden beneath her religious covering, was disheveled and unkempt, suggesting that basic hygiene requirements had been ignored during her confinement. Most alarming of all, Sister Catherine's mental state showed signs of deterioration that reminded Jake painfully of prisoners of war he had encountered during his military service. She stared at him with the blank incomprehension of someone whose ability to process unexpected events had been compromised by prolonged stress and isolation. Jake approached her slowly and spoke in the gentlest voice he could manage while still conveying the urgency of their situation. "Sister Catherine, my name is Jake Thompson. I'm here to get you out of this place and take you somewhere safe. Can you understand what I'm telling you?" Sister Catherine's response was delayed and confused. as if she were trying to remember how normal human conversation was supposed to function. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse from disuse and carried the fragile quality of someone whose confidence in reality had been systematically undermined. "Are you real, or am I dreaming again? Sometimes I dream that people come to help me, but then I wake up and I'm still here in the chains." Her words carried heartbreaking evidence of the psychological torture she had endured, and Jake felt his determination to see Agnes punished for her cruelty intensify beyond anything he had previously experienced. Jake knelt beside Sister Catherine and began examining the chains that secured her to the bell mechanism itself. The restraint system was more elaborate than he had anticipated, involving not just the rope binding her wrists, but also iron shackles around her ankles that were connected to the tower's structural elements by heavy chains. The complexity of Sister Catherine's restraints meant that freeing her would require more time and create more noise than Jake had planned for in his operational timeline. Each lock mechanism would need to be defeated individually, and the chains themselves were too heavy to be moved silently across the stone floor of the bell chamber. Jake's assessment of the situation was interrupted by sounds from below that indicated the diversion phase of the operation was nearing its end. Tommy's theft alarm had been investigated and dismissed as a false activation, and the normal security routine was being re-established around the bell tower. Brother Francis would resume his patrol pattern within minutes, eliminating the window of opportunity for a quiet escape. The compressed timeline forced Jake to choose between attempting a perfect extraction that would leave no evidence of outside intervention and accepting a higher-risk approach that would ensure Sister Catherine's freedom regardless of consequences to himself. The choice, when viewed in terms of her immediate survival needs, was straightforward. Jake began working on Sister Catherine's restraints with the systematic efficiency of someone whose training had emphasized results over elegance. He used his climbing tools and improvised implements to defeat the lock mechanisms, accepting the metallic sounds this process created while monitoring the activity below through the bell chamber's windows. Sister Catherine gradually began to understand that her rescue was real rather than another cruel dream designed to increase her psychological suffering. As Jake freed her wrists from the rope bindings, she attempted to assist with the process, though her weakened condition limited her ability to contribute effectively to her own liberation. The removal of Sister Catherine's ankle shackles proved more challenging than Jake had anticipated, requiring techniques that created unavoidable noise as metal scraped against stone. Each sound seemed magnified in the confined space of the bell chamber, and Jake knew that anyone listening carefully from below would recognize that unauthorized activity was occurring in the tower. His fears were confirmed when Brother Francis's voice called out from the base of the tower, demanding to know the source of the sounds he had detected from above. The monk's challenge indicated that the covert phase of the rescue operation had ended and that Jake would need to complete Sister Catherine's extraction under active opposition from Agnes's supporters. Jake made rapid final adjustments to his equipment while explaining to Sister Catherine that their descent from the tower would require her to trust him completely and follow his instructions without hesitation. Her mental state remained fragile, but she seemed to understand the gravity of their situation and nodded her agreement to whatever actions he deemed necessary. The sound of heavy footsteps ascending the tower's internal staircase indicated that Brother Francis was climbing toward the bell chamber to investigate the disturbance personally. Jake estimated they had perhaps 2 minutes before the monk reached their level and discovered that Sister Catherine was no longer secured in her chains. Jake positioned Sister Catherine at the window opening he had used to enter the bell chamber and began rigging the rope system that would allow them to descend the tower's exterior wall together. The technical aspects of this operation were more complex than the climbing phase had been, since Jake needed to support Sister Catherine's weight while controlling their descent rate and maintaining contact with the stone wall. Sister Catherine's fear of heights became apparent as she looked down the 60-foot drop to the ground below. But Jake's calm confidence helped steady her nerves enough to permit the beginning of their descent. He secured the rope around both their bodies in a configuration that would distribute the load safely while allowing him to control their movement down the tower's face. The descent began just as Brother Francis reached the bell chamber and discovered Sister Catherine's empty chains. The monk's shouts of alarm echoed across the church grounds, immediately alerting the armed guards and Mother Superior Agnes to the fact that their prisoner was escaping. Within moments, the entire security force was mobilizing to prevent Sister Catherine from reaching safety. Jake and Sister Catherine were approximately halfway down the tower's exterior wall when the first guard appeared at the base of the structure, looking up at them with the grim determination of someone whose professional reputation depended on preventing their escape. The guard shouted commands for them to halt their descent, backing up his demands with the obvious threat of armed force. Jake's military experience had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, where success depended on maintaining forward momentum despite hostile opposition. He continued the descent at maximum safe speed while shielding Sister Catherine from potential gunfire with his own body, accepting the personal risk as part of the responsibility he had undertaken. The community members participating in Mrs. Fletcher's social gathering had become aware of the dramatic events unfolding at the bell tower, and several of them moved closer to observe the confrontation between Jake and Anne's security forces. Their presence created additional complexity for the guards, who were reluctant to use weapons with civilian witnesses present to testify about their actions. Jake and Sister Catherine reached the ground with Agnes herself approaching at a rapid pace, her face contorted with rage at seeing her carefully planned transfer operation disrupted by outside intervention. The Mother Superior began shouting orders for the guards to seize both escapees, her authoritative voice carrying across the church grounds with unmistakable fury. The moment Jake's feet touched solid ground, he knew that the rescue operation had entered its most dangerous phase. Sister Catherine was free from her tower prison, but they were still surrounded by hostile forces in an environment where Agnes possessed significant advantages in terms of legal authority and armed support. The success of Sister Catherine's rescue would ultimately depend on factors that extended far beyond Jake's individual capabilities, including the courage of community members who had remained silent too long and the moral authority of truth. When confronted with institutional corruption, the real battle for Sister Catherine's freedom was just beginning. Jake positioned himself between Sister Catherine and the approaching guards, his hand moving instinctively toward the Colt revolver concealed beneath his jacket. The weapon represented his final option for protecting Sister Catherine, though. Drawing it would transform their escape, attempt into an armed confrontation with consequences that could destroy any chance of peaceful resolution. Mother Superior Agnes reached the scene with her black robes billowing like storm clouds, her austere features twisted into an expression of absolute fury that revealed the true nature behind her carefully maintained facade of religious authority. She pointed an accusing finger at Jake while addressing the assembled community members in a voice that carried across the church grounds with commanding intensity. "This man is a criminal who has violated the sanctity of our holy mission through theft and assault," Agnes declared, her words calculated to justify whatever actions her guards might take to recapture Sister Catherine. "He has stolen church property and committed sacrilege against blessed ground. I demand that he be arrested immediately and that Sister Catherine be returned to proper religious custody." The accusation hung in the evening air like incense, and Jake could see several community members wavering as they struggled to reconcile their sympathy for Sister Catherine with their ingrained respect for ecclesiastical authority. Agnes possessed significant advantages in any public confrontation, including legal recognition of her position and the presumption of legitimacy that accompanied religious office. Jake's response needed to shift the focus from abstract questions of authority to concrete evidence of abuse that the community could witness directly. He helped Sister Catherine stand more steadily while ensuring that her physical condition remained visible to everyone present, letting her obvious suffering speak more eloquently than any words he might offer in their defense. Dr. Carter materialized from the crowd of onlookers with the professional bearing that marked his position as the community's medical authority. The physician approached Sister Catherine with obvious concern, his trained eye immediately cataloging the evidence of malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma that 18 days of imprisonment had inflicted upon her weakened frame. "Mother Superior," Dr. Carter said in a voice that carried clearly across the church grounds, "this woman requires immediate medical attention. Her condition suggests prolonged deprivation of basic necessities, including adequate food, water, and sanitary facilities. As the territorial medical officer for this region, I'm obligated to report suspected cases of criminal neglect to appropriate authorities." Anna's face flushed with anger at this challenge to her authority from someone whose professional standing rivaled her own. "Dr. Carter, you exceed your jurisdiction when you interfere with internal church discipline. Sister Catherine's spiritual welfare has been properly supervised by qualified religious authorities who understand her needs better than secular medical practitioners." The exchange between Agnes and Dr. Carter provided Jake with the opening he needed to address the assembled community directly. His military experience had taught him to recognize moments when public opinion could be swayed through honest testimony delivered with conviction and courage. "Folks, I'm not asking you to take my word for anything," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command responsibility. "Just look at this woman and decide for yourselves whether what's been done to her represents religious discipline or criminal abuse. Sister Catherine was chained in that tower without adequate food, water, or sanitation for 18 days. That's torture by any reasonable definition, regardless of what theological justification might be offered." Sister Catherine herself provided the most powerful testimony through her obvious struggle to remain upright despite her weakened condition. Mrs. Fletcher moved forward to offer physical support, her maternal instincts overriding any concerns about challenging religious authority. The bakery owner's actions seemed to release other community members from their paralysis, and several additional people stepped forward to form a protective circle around Sister Catherine. Brother Francis appeared from the tower's entrance, his robes disheveled from his rapid ascent, to investigate the disturbance in the bell chamber. The monk's arrival provided Agnes with additional support, but it also reminded everyone present of the security measures that had been necessary to maintain Sister Catherine's imprisonment against her will. The chains and locks were for her own protection, Brother Francis declared, though his defensive tone suggested he understood how unconvincing the explanation sounded to neutral observers. Sister Catherine was suffering from spiritual delusions that made her dangerous to herself and others. The confinement was therapeutic rather than punitive. Young Tommy Wilson chose this moment to emerge from his concealment near the church's main entrance, his youthful face flushed with excitement and moral indignation. The boy had witnessed the entire rescue operation from his hiding place and possessed first-hand knowledge of Enz's systematic intimidation campaign against community members who had expressed sympathy for Sister Catherine. "That's not true, Brother Francis, and you know it," Tommy called out with the fearless honesty that only youth could muster in such circumstances. "I heard Mother Superior Agnes tell you that Sister Catherine needed to be broken completely before she could be transferred to the mountain convent. She said that public examples were necessary to prevent other nuns from questioning her authority." Tommy's testimony struck the assembled crowd like lightning, providing specific evidence of malicious intent that transformed the situation from a theological dispute into a clear case of criminal abuse. Aniz's face went pale as she realized that her private conversations had been overheard and could be used as evidence against her. The Mother Superior attempted to regain control of the situation, through the exercise of raw authority rather than persuasion. She turned toward the armed guards and issued direct commands for them to seize Sister Catherine and arrest Jake for criminal trespassing and theft of church property. The guards hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with using force against a crowd that included prominent community members and potential witnesses to their actions. Their reluctance provided Jake with additional time to consolidate the moral advantage that truthful testimony had created among the assembled townspeople. Father Hayes appeared at the edge of the crowd, having somehow escaped from his forced confinement in the church rectory. The priest's arrival electrified the situation because his presence represented legitimate religious authority that could challenge Agnes's claims directly, rather than relying solely on secular opposition to her actions. Mother Superior Agnes, Father Hayes said with quiet dignity that carried more authority than shouting could have achieved, I have reviewed the canonical procedures governing disciplinary actions within our religious community. Your treatment of Sister Catherine violates established church law in multiple respects, and your refusal to permit medical evaluation constitutes criminal negligence under territorial statutes. Agnes's response revealed the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed authority was crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. She began issuing contradictory orders to her guards, while simultaneously attempting to justify her actions through increasingly implausible theological arguments that convinced no one present. The turning point came when Sister Catherine herself found the strength to speak directly to the community that had known and loved her during 3 years of dedicated service. Her voice was weak from disuse and trauma, but her words carried the moral authority of someone who had suffered unjustly and survived to bear witness. I was chained in that tower because I refused to stop teaching children whose families couldn't afford school fees, Sister Catherine said, her statement cutting through the theological complexity to reveal the simple human truth at the heart of the conflict. Mother Superior Agnes ordered me to turn away children who needed education, and when I asked how such a policy served God's will, she declared me spiritually rebellious and dangerous to church authority. Sister Catherine's testimony provided the final piece of evidence necessary to transform community sympathy into active resistance against Agnes's tyrannical rule. The assembled townspeople began expressing their outrage more openly, with several prominent citizens demanding that territorial authorities be contacted immediately to investigate the situation. Mrs. Fletcher took charge of the community response. With the natural leadership that had made her establishment the informal center of Cedar Falls social life, she organized several women to provide immediate care for Sister Catherine, while directing the men to secure the church grounds and prevent any attempt to remove evidence of the abuse that had occurred. The armed guards found themselves isolated and outnumbered by an increasingly hostile crowd that no longer recognized Agnes's authority as legitimate. Without community support or legal justification for their presence, the guards were reduced to protecting themselves rather than enforcing Agnes's commands. Jake realized that the immediate crisis had passed and that Sister Catherine's safety was now secured by community action rather than individual intervention. His role was transitioning from active rescuer to witness and supporter of the legal processes that would hold Agnes accountable for her criminal abuse of authority. Dr. Carter began a thorough medical examination of Sister Catherine, documenting her injuries and condition with the professional thoroughness necessary to support criminal charges against Agnes and her supporters. The physician's findings would provide crucial evidence for territorial prosecutors, who would ultimately decide whether justice would be served through the legal system. As dawn approached over Cedar Falls, the transformation of the community's response to religious tyranny was complete. What had begun as individual fear and paralysis had evolved into collective courage and determination to protect vulnerable members from institutional abuse. Agnes's reign of intimidation was over, ended not by outside authority, but by ordinary people who had found the strength to stand together against injustice. Jake stood at the edge of the crowd, watching Sister Catherine receive the care and support she deserved while reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. He had arrived in Cedar Falls as a drifting ex-soldier, seeking only temporary shelter, but the town's crisis had provided him with something far more valuable, a chance to use his skills and experience for a cause that gave meaning to his existence. Sister Catherine's recovery would take time, but she was surrounded by people who valued her contributions and were committed to ensuring her safety. The legal proceedings against Agnes would provide additional protection and might prevent similar abuses in other communities throughout the territory. Jake's intervention had succeeded beyond his most optimistic expectations, transforming not just Sister Catherine's situation, but the entire community's ability to resist institutional corruption. The bell tower that had served as her prison would soon ring again, calling the faithful to worship in a church where authority served the people rather than oppressing them. As the sun rose over the New Mexico desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Thompson understood that his years of wandering had finally led him to where he belonged. Cedar Falls had given him a home, a purpose, and a community worth protecting, while his military skills had found their proper application in defending the innocent against those who would abuse their power. The woman who had been chained to the church bell was free. The community that had been paralyzed by fear was empowered to protect itself. And the loner cowboy had discovered that true freedom came not from running away from responsibility, but from accepting it completely. Sister Catherine looked up at Jake with eyes that held gratitude beyond words, and he saw in her expression the validation of every risk he had taken and every principle he had upheld during the long night of her rescue. Some things were worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost, and the freedom of the innocent was foremost among them. The bronze bell of St. Mary's Mission Church would ring again, carrying across the desert the sound of liberty restored and justice served. And in that sound, Jake Thompson would hear the echo of his own redemption, earned through courage in the service of others and the recognition that a man's true worth was measured by his willingness to stand against darkness when standing was required. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.